A woman arranged for her pastor to visit her. And so at the appointed time, he called on her and he rang the doorbell. And when he didn't get any response, he rang it again several times. And then knocked very loudly. But still there wasn't any answer. In spite of the fact he thought he could hear a scurrying noise inside. And he dismissed it. He finally decided, well, maybe she wasn't in there, or had changed her mind, or didn't hear his knock or his ring, or didn't want to come to the door. So he took out his calling card and left a scripture written on the back, which was Revelation 3, verse 20. Well, after he had gone, she came to the door and saw that he left a card, and so she went back and looked up Revelation 3:20, which says, "Behold, I stand at the door and knock." The next Sabbath, after church services, she came up to him, shook his hand, and handed his card back to him with the scripture Genesis 3:10 on the back. Now, for all of you who don't know that right off the top of your head, he went back to his study and looked up Genesis 3:10, which says, "I heard the sound of thee, and I was afraid because I was naked." And I'm sure that would be understandable. Anyway, in Job 1, verse 21, Job 1:21, we're told that naked came I out of my mother's womb, and naked shall I return thither. The Lord gave, and the Lord hath taken away. Blessed be the name of the Lord. And you know, that's very true. Unless we're unless we're still alive at Christ's return and change at the resurrection, when we die, we are pretty naked. I mean, you may have some clothes on if you're cremated, but they're gone very rapidly. And if you're buried in the ground, it doesn't take too long before, the clothes that you're wearing to disintegrate. Well, the example of physical nakedness just mentioned is found in a number of places in the Bible, several of which we're going to look at now. And some of these are instructional in nature because of the context. So let's start by going to James 2, verse 15. James 2, verse 15, which says, "If a brother or sister be naked and destitute of daily food." So this is someone who is really in dire straits. You don't see too many naked people wandering around the streets, but you certainly see people who are street people that wear very threadbare clothes. A lot of times with no coats or anything, or tattered blankets wrapped around them. "If a brother or sister be naked and destitute of daily food," verse 16, "and one of you say unto them, depart in peace, be you warmed and filled." I know things are going to turn the corner for you. I know that it's going to be all right. Just go on your way. It'll be okay. Notwithstanding, you give them not those things which are needful to the body. What good does it do? What doth it profit as a Christian when you acknowledge there's a need and yet you don't do anything about it? You don't fill it. You don't try to help them. And verse 17 says, even so, faith, if it hath not works, is dead, being alone. So you have to recognize that if you see a need and you could do something to help the person in need, but just say, well, I'll pray for you. Go on your way. I'll see you next Sabbath. That's not what we're supposed to be doing. We're supposed to be concerned, considerate, looking out for our brothers and sisters. Matthew 25, verse 34. Matthew 25, verse 34. Then shall the king say unto them on his right hand, and this is the parable where Jesus is talking about separating the sheep and the goats and their various positions later on, making the sheep the good guys and the goats the bad guys. Not that there's any distinction when it comes to animals in that regard. It is just for illustration purposes. Then shall the king say unto them on his right hand, Come, you blessed of my Father, inherit the kingdom prepared for you from the foundation of the world. Verse 35, For I was a-hungered, and you gave me meat. I was thirsty, and you gave me drink. I was a stranger, and you took me in. So each time this group of people recognized a need with their brethren. If they were hungry, if they didn't have any food to eat, if they didn't have food stamps, or they didn't have some way of getting food, they recognized them and gave them meat. And the same with being thirsty. They didn't have milk for their children or orange juice for their children. Well, they recognized that need and they fulfilled it. I was a stranger and you took me in. I was new in town. I didn't have a place to stay while I was looking for housing. And so you invited me to stay with you during that period of time. Verse 36, naked and you clothed me. So here again, they recognize the need. Person only had one, suit of clothes maybe. Was going to be interviewing for a job, and these were threadbare and didn't give a very good impression. So they recognized that fact and provided them with some. Maybe bought them a new set so they'd be very presentable. I was sick and you visited me. Of course, that's self-explanatory. We do that all the time. I was in prison and you came unto me. Now, I, in the past, have not really had any reason to visit prison or anyone in prison because I didn't know anyone in prison. At least if they were in prison, it was in some far place. But even then, in thinking about it, I don't think I knew anyone unless someone had described them from the pulpit and asked, that we pray for them for, whatever reason, maybe to get out of prison. But my first personal experience happened last June when I got a request forwarded from the letter answering department that there was a man who'd been writing to the church since 2012 and had requested baptism. And he happened to be in the Monroe Correctional Center out at Monroe. And so I went through the procedure which you have to do in order to be able to visit anyone. You fill out a form online so they can check your background to make sure that you're not going to create some problems, for the prison or the prisoners. And after about 30 days, I finally got accepted in early July. So I went out to meet this man for the first time and got acquainted with him. You have to go through 2 gates, at least in the particular area he was in, that you stand in front of the gate, and it's kind of a peculiar experience because there's no one there, but they can see you. And I guess they match your personage with the picture that they have, that was furnished with your driver's license or some other type of identification, so they know you're okay. And so you hear this click, and then the door is capable of being pulled open. So you go through one door and walk up a little ways, and there's another door. And there's the first time you go, it's a little unnerving because there aren't any instructions as to how to do all of this. I just stood there kind of dumbly looking at it because there wasn't any place to push a button or anything like that. Same with the second gate. And I heard a click, so I went through, and then I went in where one of the guards takes down your information. And then you go through either one of these devices like you go through at the airport, or if you can't go through it for some reason, the guard pats you down. And then you go through another series of steps or an elevator, and finally you get down to where you're to meet the prisoner. So that was my first experience, and I went 2 other times and probably will be going again, although I have passed the information on to Mr. Slocum because he's pretty close compared to where I am and probably could be more flexible in getting over to see this man. But anyway, I was in prison, and you came unto me. 37, verse 37. Then shall the righteous answer him, saying, Lord, when saw we thee an hungered and fed thee? I don't remember seeing you then anywhere along the way. Fed thee or thirsty and gave thee drink. When saw we thee a stranger and took thee in, or naked and clothed thee? Or when saw we thee sick or in prison and came unto thee? And then here's the very interesting thing that we always have to remember, and the verse about entertaining angels unaware. You never know the background of people you run into and how important that can be. He says, verily unto you, inasmuch as you've done it unto one of the least of these my brethren, you have done it unto me. As Christians, that is what is expected of us. We read all of the scriptures that talk about doing unto others as we shall have them, do unto us, or of helping and giving and serving. And that's what is expected of us. In whatever capacity we can do anything. Some people are limited because of health reasons. Others are limited for financial reasons or geographically have limitations. But to the extent we can, we need to be doing what we can if we see a need. 1 Timothy 6, verse 6. 1 Timothy 6, verse 6. But godliness with contentment is great gain, for we brought nothing into this world, and it's certain we can carry nothing out. I know you've heard this before, but it certainly is worth repeating, where someone said he'd never seen a hearse towing a U-Haul, which simply means that whatever it is you're doing in your life to acquire some material thing, and you can pick your own choice of what it is, you're not going to take it with you. You may think you are, and you may act like you are, but it ain't going to happen. When you leave the earth, you're not taking anything. Verse 8, and because of this, and having food and raiment, having something to eat and something to wear, and maybe it's modest clothing, but if you at least have it, you're well ahead of a lot of other people around the world who don't have it. And so having food and clothing, let us be therewith content. I remember hearing about a man who had inherited his father's fortune of $50 million, and this was around the turn of the century. I'm not exactly sure of the date, but just for the fun of it, I calculated based on cost of living, and there are calculators on the internet that do it very rapidly for you, what the 50 million would have been like in today's dollars, and that would have been 1,366,000, and I dropped off the change and the odd amounts. But it's a sizable amount, and would have been a sizable amount back at that time. But the interesting thing was, when he was asked by a reporter how he felt, he said, well, I still wear only one suit a day, and I only eat 3 meals a day. A very, very wise observation. In spite of that immense amount of money, he understood that. He had a pretty good perspective, I think, and pretty wise observation at that time for someone his age. Oftentimes in movies or on TV, sometimes you'll see a picture of a woman's closet, and this is usually someone that is pretty well off, with hundreds of pairs of shoes lined up, in rows and on shelves, despite the fact that you can only wear one pair at a time. But, when I mentioned this to one of my daughters, when she was younger, she said, but Dad, we live in America, and we're used to that. I, of course, didn't need to remind her that you may live in America, but as long as you're living with me, unless you can afford to buy shoes of that quantity and quality, you're going to have to be content with a certain standard of living. I've seen a complete change of attitude in later years as my daughters have moved out, married, had children, acquired a certain type of maturity that comes from simply living. And at the same time, they've also gained an understanding of the things that really make people happy. Years ago in the church, when it was still worldwide, they used to have what they called leadership training classes. And some of you may have been in them or were familiar with them. But one thing that I remember from one of the lessons, and it was a very simple statement, but it answers a lot of questions and makes a lot of sense. And it was simply this: an uncluttered life leads to happiness. An uncluttered life leads to happiness. We don't need our lives cluttered with a lot of material things and clothes or shoes that are never worn. I'm just guessing that if you went home and counted all the clothes in your closet, you probably would find that you only wear about a third of them. And the rest are simply taking up space, either waiting for the time when you lose weight or gain weight in some cases, but probably the former, mostly lose weight, so you'd be able to wear them again. Or maybe in some cases they've been there so long they're totally out of style. Remember, and here again, I'm not knocking the ability to have things like this if, big if. I don't think there's many people in the church that are at that level where they can afford those things, but there probably are some. As long as you remember, an uncluttered life leads to happiness. Turn to Ezekiel 18, verse 5. Ezekiel 18, verse 5. But if a man be just and do that which is lawful and that which is right, lawful and right, and he lists several things, and then verse 7, in addition, hath not oppressed any, but hath restored to the debtor his pledge, hath spoiled none by violence, hath given his bread to the hungry, and hath covered the naked with a garment. Very important things for a Christian to do. Look around you, see who is hungry, and then do something about it. Or look around and see who doesn't have clothing or suitable clothing for different things, and then help to the extent you can. Those things right here are what God considers lawful and right, and show us, what we need to do in order to fulfill them. Psalm 37, verse 23. Psalm 37, verse 23. The steps of a good man are ordered by the Eternal, and he delighteth in his way. Though he fall, he shall not be utterly cast down, for the Eternal upholdeth him with his hand. We're all going to stumble, we're all going to fall, we're all going to make mistakes, but we can and we will recover from them if we're obeying God. Verse 25, I have been young and now am old, yet have I not seen the righteous forsaken, nor his seed begging bread. And you might ask the question, well, why is that? Why don't you see that? I think you understand the righteous, by that very definition, are being obedient to God's laws And in doing so, they're guaranteed to be blessed. They're promised those blessings in the early part of Genesis. Those promises are enunciated in a number of ways. There is physical nakedness, which we've seen examples of, but we can also be affected by spiritual nakedness as well. You know, providing for our children and our spouses physically is certainly very important. But what about providing for them spiritually as well? That's a 24/7 job that never ends. It will never end as long as you're alive. If you have children, if you have a spouse, if you have relatives that have a need, then you're required to address that need, whether it's physical or spiritual or both. You know, there's one thing about that too, and that is that when I'm talking about teaching here, it's not necessarily the things you say, because our examples teach the people that we're trying to impress with the truth. The examples teach them much or more than any other single thing that we try to do for them by talking to them. You know, you can rattle off a number of scriptures to someone, and they can go right in one ear and out the next or the other. Well, let's look at spiritual nakedness and see how it is treated. Ephesians 6 and verse 10. Ephesians 6, verse 10. Finally, my brethren, be strong in the eternal and in the power of his might. Put on the whole armor of God, that you may be able to stand against the wiles of the devil. This is nothing new. You've heard this series of scriptures read many times. That doesn't mean the truth changes. It just means that from time to time we need to refresh our memory about the importance. Verse 14. Therefore, having your loins girt, or encircled, surrounded with truth, and having on the breastplate of righteousness. And if you think of what a breastplate covers, that's this area of your body. It covers the most critical organs in your body: your heart, your lungs, your stomach, all of the other things like kidneys, liver, etc., etc. Some of you have probably seen people who have, either through disease or through accidents, or in some cases they were born that way, people who have only a torso and a head, no legs, no arms. Some of them have done remarkably well with that kind of a handicap. I wouldn't like to have lose the end of one of my fingers. And I can't imagine what it's like in not having limbs. Well, that is the reason for the breastplate of righteousness. When it comes to our spiritual nakedness, we need that breastplate to cover the most critical things in our spiritual lives, and as well of the shield, not the shield, but the helmet for the head, which of course is the other major component. Verse 15, and your feet shod with the preparation of the gospel of peace. Above all, taking the shield of faith, wherewith you shall be able to quench all the fiery darts of the wicked. And you know, Satan is hurling those darts at us all of the time. He doesn't take a vacation. If you were to look at his schedule, you wouldn't see an area blocked out saying vacation. You know, he doesn't think in those terms. He is working all the time. Verse 17, and take the helmet of salvation and the sword of the Spirit, which is the word of God, praying always with all prayer and supplication in the Spirit, and watching thereunto with all perseverance and supplication for all saints. So these elements of our lives are very critical. Praying always, underline always, continually, be in a continual state of prayer. You know, quite a few years ago, when my two oldest daughters were still in high school, we had to really prod them to get ready for church. They would fool around and dilly-dally around and do everything. They would play, they would listen to music, the radio, and find everything they could do to distract them from getting ready. But usually, not always, but usually once they got started, they, for the most part, had the impetus to move ahead. But like I said, not always. Because they did like spending time with their church friends and participating in the activities that usually took place after services for the young people. However, both Patty and Kelly were notoriously slow when it came to getting ready. So one morning, my male ego got the better part of me, and I gave them an ultimatum. I said, we are going to leave at 11:30 a.m. on the dot. And if you aren't ready and in the car at that time, we're going to leave without you. That day, I stressed the fact that I was scheduled to give the sermonette, so I needed to be on time. So 11:30 arrived, and as I thought might occur, no girls. So Veronica and I got in the car and left. Now, Veronica wasn't too keen about leaving them home, even though they were probably 14 and 15 at that time, and old enough because they often babysat for other people's children in the church and outside of the church. So I wasn't concerned so much about leaving them on their own. But as we drove out of the driveway, I think I was just a little too smug, thinking to myself, I'll teach those girls a lesson. Now, Veronica is their stepmother, which they used at times as leverage to get their way, because she was and still is a softie and always has been a great advocate for them and more prone to give them the benefit of the doubt than I did. In other words, I usually played the role of the bad cop in a good cop, bad cop scenario. But nothing this particular morning could change my mind. And so we lived about 5 miles out of town, and we drove to Monroe and then to Bothell, picked up 405, headed south, turned right where 520 crosses the Evergreen Point Bridge, crossed the bridge. We got off at the Montlake exit and began making our way on the back roads leading up toward the Scottish Rite on Capitol Hill, which was where the church met for many years. I had just come to a complete stop at a four-way stop intersection when all of a sudden there was this loud noise, just like an explosion, and our heads were snapped back against the headrest as our car shot out into the middle of the intersection, where we sat for a few minutes, somewhat dazed, trying to process what had just happened. It took me a moment to realize we'd been rear-ended, and so I drove the car out of the intersection and parked it in the block ahead, and then walked back to see what had happened. I found a frail, elderly man behind the wheel of this very, very large Chrysler, which our Chevy Nova was no match for when it came to weight. He was okay and was a little sheepish about his part in the event. He was very apologetic and apparently didn't realize we were stopped or wasn't paying attention until it was too late. We exchanged insurance information, and I went on to church because the car was still drivable. The bumper had been pushed in and dented. The trunk lid had to be tied down because it's been popped, and the taillights were broken, but none of these things affected the drivability. Understandably, I was a little shaky, but we made it on time, and I did give my sermonette. The point is, and the reason for telling this little vignette, is that if I hadn't been so smug about leaving the girls at home so we could get to church on time, the chances are we probably wouldn't have been at that particular intersection at that particular time and wouldn't have had the accident at all. You know, of course, time and chance happens to all of us. So I guess someone could argue that maybe we might have been in a more serious accident where we or our daughters could have been injured. You know, I suppose that possibility existed, but it didn't happen that way, and there's no way of knowing other than just pure conjecture that it ever would have happened that way. However, I'm sure that among the lessons God taught me that particular morning was that I could have been or should have been a little more lenient with my daughters and handled that situation in a more loving, patient, and forgiving manner. And secondly, probably more than anything else, I should have listened to my wife. Now, of course, none of you men have that problem, I'm sure. But sometimes our wives can give us a good insight into different things, and we shouldn't ignore them. As parents, we hopefully are able to learn lessons from events such as this. Turn to Revelation 3, verse 16. Revelation 3, verse 16. So then, because thou art lukewarm and neither cold nor hot, I will spew thee out of my mouth. Because you say, I'm rich and increase with goods. Now look at all the material things I have. Look at the house I live in. Look at the car I drive. Look at the job I have. Look at all of these things. You say you have need of nothing, but you don't know. You know not that you're wretched, miserable, poor, blind, and naked. You are spiritually naked. The way God looks at you, all of those material things have absolutely zero meaning to him. He owns the universe. You know, sometimes we get so tied up with material possessions that they really can be a block to our Christian life. Now, I'm not saying there's anything wrong with them, and don't misunderstand me, because after tithing for a number of years, I'm sure many people are blessed because of that, and materially are all right. It's just that you can't look at those things and let them sidetrack you. Romans 8, verse 35. Romans 8, verse 35. Who shall separate us from the love of Christ? Shall tribulation, distress, persecution, famine, nakedness, peril, or sword? Will any of those things separate you from your connection to Jesus and to his Father? Well, they shouldn't. Isaiah 58, verse 7. Isaiah 58, verse 7. Is it not to deal thy bread to the hungry, and that thou bring the poor that are cast out to thy house? When thou seest the naked, that thou cover him, and that thou hide not thyself from thy own flesh? You know, how do we cover them spiritually? With our prayers, or if they listen to us, with our suggestions. And one of the first would be to counsel with one of your spiritual elders, or one of our spiritual elders. One of the saddest things that I have seen, and for the life of me, it's hard to fathom it and understand it, how some people will let something bubble up, boil, build up for years regarding their relationship with some other person. It can be inside or outside of the church, until it finally culminates and explodes into a full-blown conflagration. Turn to 2 Corinthians 5, verse 2. I'm reading this from the NIV. 2 Corinthians 5, verse 2. Meanwhile, we groan, longing to be clothed instead with our heavenly dwelling. That is our goal. Verse 3, because when we are clothed, we will not be found naked. When you're clothed spiritually, and everything is covering your body, as we saw in Ephesians 6, you won't be found naked. You know, God, as it were, sits on the brink of eternity and looks down on us at this time, looks not only at us, but looks at every depraved, sordid example of humanity that's lived in the past, is alive now, or will be in the future. And because of his infinite love for his creation, he was willing and to sacrifice his son to give us freedom and access to living forever. You know, I'm talking about those people that we read about in history books. For example, well-known one, like Hitler, who in a diabolical fashion set out to eliminate the Jewish race. I know we tend to think that because of the enormity of the things which they did, that they will be the first to be thrown into the lake of fire. I mean, humanly, physically, that's what you would tend to think when you see the pictures of all the people who were gassed and Auschwitz and some of the other death camps, thrown into these big pits. And you think to yourself, how could people treat other people like that? They won't have a chance. But you know, when we think that way, that type of thinking totally ignores God's generosity to give everyone a chance. I think we may be surprised by some of the people that we meet in the future. In just a little over 7 weeks from now, we will all be here for the Passover. And I can assure you, in fact, I can guarantee you that Satan will be going at it overtime in the intervening time. And some of you have already had examples of things happening of a serious nature because I've heard about them. He will be going all out and doing his best to create situations that will discourage us, depress us, disillusion us, disappoint us, and attempt to create a catalyst to make us feel like quitting, to give up, and to say, well, what's the use? When those feelings begin to well up and overtake us, we need to pause and think of the most joyous love relationship we've ever experienced in our lives, whether it be mother and daughter, father or son, husband or wife, or any other relationship that was outstanding in that regard. And then remember that God loves Hitler and everyone like him, despite the heinous crimes they have, are, and will commit, so much that he gave up his son to give them, which is hard for us to fathom, like I said, and hard for us to understand, give them all a chance along with us to become a part of his eternal family. Both physical and spiritual nakedness are conditions that need to be treated. We need to be sure we are doing our part in helping to treat and eliminate those conditions from our lives, our families' lives, as well as our neighbors and strangers, as the case may be. Our Father is not going to let us down. He wants us to succeed. He stands by us, ready to help us cover our physical and our spiritual nakedness with his all-encompassing, powerful, and yet everlasting love.